Bob Zarrole is one of the most viewed React instructors in the world. And now he's back with a brand new complete React course that will teach you modern React using patterns like functional components and hooks. If you want to learn the React JavaScript library, this is the video.
Hey free code campers, welcome to my newest course on learning React. In this course, you're going to solve over 140 different coding challenges and work on 8 different projects, all of which have an associated Figma design file to guide your work. And you actually have 2 options for following along. Either by using your local machine, I actually have a few lessons that'll show you how to do that starting pretty early in this course. Or you can head over to Scrimba.com where there's an interactive version of this course so that you can solve the challenges directly in your browser. It's totally up to you what you want to do. The link to the course on Scrimba.com is provided below. And actually, this course is part of a larger front-end career path, which we have at Scrimba, which takes people from zero to hireable as a front-end developer. This course is module 11 in that career path, and my more advanced React course immediately follows this free React course as module 12, where I go even more in depth into React, React Router, using the Context API, and so much more. If those topics sound confusing to you, don't worry at all. You don't need to take them to understand this course. Now, I always appreciate any feedback you have for me about the course, so you're welcome to reach out to me on Twitter at Bob Zarrole, or if you have any questions about your specific code, the best place for those is to either reach out to the Free Code Camp forums or Discord server, or you can check out Scrimba's own Discord server, which is becoming a more and more deeply integrated part of the whole Scrimba.com experience. And with that, good luck and have a ton of fun learning React.
Hey there, and welcome to the Learn React module. I'm super excited you're joining me for this course because by the end you'll have built not 1, not 2, but at least 8 projects using React. There's so many of them, I don't even have time to go over each one of them in detail right now. I could barely even fit them on this slide. So why are we doing so many projects? Well, it's because I designed the curriculum for this course to be project-driven. In each of the sections, we will start with a goal project that we are working toward, and then we'll learn everything we need in order to build that project. Now, in order for that approach to actually work, I'm going to be asking a lot from you. So let's talk for just a bit on how you can get the most from this course. Just like everything in life, what you put into this course is what you will get out of it. Or as I like to say, my philosophy about learning is that the easiest way to learn something is to do it the hard way. In this course, I'm going to be asking you to do a lot of the work. For much of it, you'll have me there after each challenge to walk you through a solution, but for some of it, you won't. Either way, what I'm asking of you now is to avoid the trap of tutorial hell, where you end up passively watching me do all the work. Remember, this is not school. You're presumably here because you actually want to finish the course with the ability to write React code by yourself. School has taught a lot of us that the goal of learning is to get a good grade. In fact, I heard something really interesting that said that education is the only thing that humans try to get less out of than what they paid for. So don't let that be you in this course. If you really give it everything you've got, meaning you do all the challenges and projects, you're involved with the community, and you are an active participant in your own learning, I can promise that you'll probably finish off in a better spot than many students getting their degree in computer science. And I really don't say that lightly. Along those lines, remember that spaced learning and repetition are your best friends. Binging the course from beginning to end, even if you are doing all the assignments, is kind of like trying to run an ultra marathon without training. Your brain actually needs rest, so take breaks often. By taking this course, the goal isn't just to get to the end, it's to get to the end with some honest-to-goodness React skills. Then after you come back to this course on maybe the next day, don't be afraid to re-watch some of the past lessons and even redo some of the past challenges. Because repetition really is your best friend whenever you're trying to learn something new. So what should you already know coming into this course? Before jumping into React, you should have a solid grasp of the fundamentals of web development, namely HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and preferably a pretty solid understanding of the new syntax that was introduced back in ECMAScript 6, ES6, and above. If you're feeling at all rusty on any of these topics, you can click the logo for each one of these, which will send you to another free course here on Scrimba, where you can brush up on those skills. My name is Bob Zarol. I'm going to be your instructor throughout this whole course. My username pretty much everywhere online is Bob Zarol, but these days I'm really most active on Twitter. You can click the Twitter icon to go to my profile if you want to follow me. That would be great. And so without any further delay, let's jump right in and start learning React. In the first section of this course, we're going to be learning everything we need in order to build a basic static page using React. And I know what you might be thinking, but I already know how to make static web pages. I know you're probably super excited to really dive in and learn dynamic web applications with React, and we are going to get there in this course. But in order to start off, this section is all about learning the basic syntax and you could say the vocabulary of React. Because I found that the best approach to learning React is to first start learning how to think in React. The reason for this is because React really does kind of change the game in terms of how you build applications. Later in this section, we are going to start learning the differences between declarative and imperative programming, and you're going to find that React approaches web development in a completely different way. So the point is, we're first going to be dialing in our brains to start thinking in terms of using React to build websites by first building some static web pages, not unlike the ones that you normally would just use HTML and CSS for. So this might not seem terribly exciting right now, but I think you'll soon see that writing composable, reusable components in React can actually be a bit addicting and pretty fun. So I know that you'll find a lot of benefit in starting off with the milk before we get to the meat, or of course we have a vegetarian option as well. The content in this section will be driven forward by the goal of creating our first static web page in React. And that's the page you see here in the screenshot that has a list of fun facts about React. Now, this screenshot is actually also a link to the Figma file for the design of this page. So if you click this screenshot, it will open up in Figma. You'll have to make sure that you log into your Figma account. If you don't have one yet, it's free to create. And clicking the screenshot will lead you to a sort of shared file that everyone will have access to. In that shared file, you'll see something near the top that looks kind of like this, where it's got React facts and then this little drop-down arrow. Your best bet is going to be to click that drop-down arrow, go over to duplicate to your drafts, and click that. Duplicating this design to your own drafts is going to make it possible for you not only to edit the design if you want to change it a little bit, but also to help you avoid any distraction you might see on the design page of anybody else's cursors or maybe some comments that they may have left. So I'll go back to this design here. Make sure to click on it now so at least the URL gets saved up in your tabs in your browser. And lastly, we're going to look at the different topics that we'll be covering in this section. So what are we going to learn about? Well, first we're going to learn why we even care about React in the first place. I think knowing why React is so exciting and so popular will help make your learning journey of React a much simpler one because you'll be so excited about what you'll be able to create in the end by using React. We'll also be talking about a proprietary React syntax called JSX, and we'll get to see how that sort of changed the game for React and made writing React a much more familiar experience. Then we'll dive into creating custom components, and you'll learn all about what that means and how to actually do that yourself in React. And of course, in order to build our project, we're going to need to know how to apply CSS styling. Again, the goal is for us to be able to build this simple static page in React. I'm really excited for us to get started. So without any further ado, let's jump right into the deep end and start writing our first React code. Before we just jump right into theory and why we care about React and how all the little pieces of React work, I want to get your hands on the keyboard typing some React code as soon as possible, mostly just to show you that React is not a scary library to be working with. So let's see how we can set up React. Now, I like to think of there as being an easy way to set up React in your project and a correct way of setting React up in your project. For our sake in learning, we're going to start with the easy way, which will also make it so that you can actually just do this in your local environment. Hopefully you're following along here on Scrimba.com, but if you're curious and you're interested, you can always do this on your local environment as well. Now you can see I have a very basic HTML page set up. I have nothing in my JavaScript at all. My CSS is minimal, and we're going to walk through this together. Now I have some slides here, And you can actually click on this screenshot and that will send you to this exact page. In the React documentation, it tells you how you can include React into your project. And we can actually pull in these libraries that we need straight from a CDN. In other words, we can just copy these two script tags here and start writing React code. There's a little more to it, but what I'm going to do is click here, and that's going to open me up to the React page. I'm just going to copy the two script tags that you can see. And over in my index.html, I'm going to put it in the head here. Let me fix the indentation. And I've pulled in the React library and another library called React DOM. Theoretically, this is all I need in order to start writing some React code. Now, I'm going to take it one step further, and that's because just pulling in React and React DOM is going to be pretty extremely limiting in terms of using the power of React, unless we also pull in something called Babel. I'm not going to jump in too deep into why we need to pull in Babel. For now, all I'm going to do is click on this screenshot here, which will take me again to a page where I can copy the script tag that you see. And I will paste that in underneath this script tag. And if we look really closely below here, it says you can use any JSX. We'll cover what JSX is later in any script tag by adding type equals text/Babel. So I'm going to do that here in my script tag down here. Type equals text/Babel. And that's all the setup we really need. By pulling in the React-DOM library in this script tag, I now have access to a global variable called React DOM. I'm going to use that to render something to the screen. Once again, I'm going to be covering everything that we're talking about here. It's totally okay if this is moving pretty quickly. React-DOM.render allows me to render something that looks very much like HTML. Now, this might be blowing your mind a little bit because this probably looks a little strange writing some HTML inside of my JavaScript. We're going to see how this is kind of one of the beautiful things that React has added so that we can write really declarative code. Now, let's put something inside this H1 that's meaningful. We had hello React over here. Maybe I'll say hello everyone. Okay, in my index.html, I'm going to get rid of this H1 so we're not confusing this H1 with what I'm seeing over here. Now, React-DOM.render, the first thing is what do I want to render to the screen? The second thing is where do I want to render it? Well, let's go to our HTML and I'm going to create a div here. Just a completely empty div, and I'm going to give it an ID so that I can select it. We'll call it root because this is going to be like the root of our entire application. I like to think of this div as a container for the entire website that we're going to build in React. And now that I have a place where I can put my H1 here, I'm going to select it with a regular DOM API document.getElementById root. And surprise, we've written some React code. I'm going to hit save. We'll see that it tells me, hello, everyone. In a single line of code, I was able to use React to insert something that looks very much like an H1. Obviously, this is a little different because we're still inside JavaScript. And I was able to put it right inside of this real DOM element in our index.html. Now, I have an entire lesson that's dedicated to understanding exactly what's going on here. But in an effort to get your hands on the code, get a quick win for you to see that you can write React and it's not too scary, I'm going to give you a few seconds of silence where you can pause the screencast and study this line of code, and then I'll be erasing it and letting you type it again from scratch. In fact, let me write that down as a little challenge here. Okay, pause the screencast here, spend just a minute memorizing this line of code. Do that now. And then I will add a little comment with the next part. Okay, your time to shine. Rewrite the line of code as best you can from memory. You don't have to put hello everyone or hello React or whatever. You even don't have to use an H1 like I did. You can put whatever HTML you want in there. So pause the screencast now and work on that. Because I pulled in that React DOM library in my CDN, I have a global variable called React DOM, and it has a render method, which allows us to render something to the screen, or kind of, in other words, place something on the screen. And I don't know, let's do a paragraph this time, just to switch it up a tiny bit. Say, hi, my name is Bob. Okay, so that's the element that I want to place inside of this div. Again, this div is a container for the actual elements that I plan on putting on the screen. And the second parameter that I need to include with React DOM.render is, you could think of it as a DOM node that I have to go select with document.getElementById, or because I can also get DOM nodes with something like query selector, that would work just as well. In this case, I'd have to put #root because that's how query selector works. It's the ID of root. Just so this isn't confusing, we'll just keep it as getElementById for now, but just so you know, either one should work just fine. So the first parameter is what do I want to place on the screen, and the second one is where should I be placing this? I imagine under the hood, what render is doing is it's taking this DOM element that we are grabbing with getElementById, and it's running something similar to .append or .appendChild to it. And what is it appending? It's appending this paragraph. We're going to see that it's a little more complicated than that, but that's a good way to kind of build a mental model for yourself as to how this is actually working. So I haven't refreshed the page yet, which is why this still says hello everyone. I'm going to hit save, which will refresh my browser, and there we go. Hi, my name is Bob. This time it's a paragraph instead of a header element, and that's awesome. We have written React in a single line of code. You might have noticed that our console is popping up with this error. You're using the in-browser Babel transformer. Be sure to pre-compile your scripts for production. A bunch of jargon here that may not totally make sense to you. And that's fine. That's a symptom of us setting up React the easy way instead of the correct way. Soon down the road, we'll be kind of shifting our setup here, and that warning will go away. And awesome. Okay, because this is Scrimba, you can always delete this. If maybe you weren't able to memorize that, you can try deleting it, rewriting it again from scratch. Practice with it. I'm going to ask you to do that a million times throughout this course because the only way to learn React is to write React as much as you can. Now, I have found it really helpful for my own learning to understand why the heck I even care about React in the first place. So in the next couple screencasts, we're going to be talking about some of those really awesome benefits that come with using React as our library for building web applications. But as always, if you want to spend more time with this, go ahead and do that. Pause, click into the editor, start typing what you want to type, practice it. And when you're ready, I will see you in the next lesson. Surprise! If you know my teaching style, I wanted to include a practice in here. Essentially, you're just going to be rewriting that same line of code that we just wrote in the last lesson. However, this time we'll extend it just a little bit. I want you to see if you can figure out how to render an unordered list with 2 or more list items inside. Last time we just rendered a paragraph. You can see it's still kind of left over here. If I refresh that, that'll disappear. I've left the entire setup here for you. We're still pulling in the script tags for React, React DOM, and Babel. So essentially your main focus is just to rewrite that same one-liner of code, but see if you can figure out how to add a couple more elements inside, like having an unordered list with some nested list items. Pause here and try to work on that challenge. Okay, pulling in the React DOM library that gives us access to a render method. Before we did a simple paragraph like this and put some code inside. However, I can put this as an unordered list and then just actually stick some list items inside of here. So it's going to look a little confusing at first. I'll clean it up in just a minute. We have list item, we'll just say thing 1, and I'll do another list item here. Thing 2. Okay. Now I'm going to move this onto its own line here, this whole HTML thing right there. And the second parameter I need to separate with a comma is where to put this. So I'm going to use document.getElementById root. And let's cross our fingers, see how this goes. Cool. Okay. Hopefully that was some good practice. Now let's keep moving forward and learn a little bit more about why we care about React. One more thing that was highly requested from the first time I recorded this React course was how can I set this up on my local environment? Everything that I'm doing will be done on Scrimba.com so that you can interact with the same code that you see me writing. However, it's also a good experience to run it locally on your own computer and get a feel for what it would be like to actually develop React on your own computer. Again, our setup here is more of the easy way than the right way, but for now what you can do is you can click the little gear icon in the lower right of your Scrimba editor, which will pop up a little menu here, and there's an option that says download as zip. That will download a zip file containing the files that we're working on here. You can uncompress that like you normally would any zip file and open that up in any editor that you'd like, for example, Visual Studio Code on your own machine. Now, in order for that to run, I'm going to show you what that looks like on Visual Studio Code. Inside of Visual Studio Code, which is what you see in this screenshot, there's a menu icon for some extensions, and you'll need to search for an extension called Live Server. It's created by Ritwik Day, and you'll need this installed to your VS Code in order to run the code that we have written in React. So you'll click the little install button. That's going to put an icon down at the very bottom menu bar in Visual Studio Code that says Go Live. And all you need to do is click that Go Live button, which will open a web page on a local server. I think it's maybe port 5000 that it runs. And that should launch your own React project on your local machine. As soon as you see me move toward a different setup for React that includes Webpack and downloaded dependencies from NPM and so forth, this is no longer going to work in quite the same way. But for now, for those that are curious, I thought I might just explain how you can get this set up on your own machine. Okay, that's enough delaying. Let's keep moving forward with the course. Let's spend a little bit of time understanding why we even care to learn React. One of the main reasons that people will talk about is how React allows us to write composable code. So what exactly do I mean by composable? Well, an analogy that I came up with has to do with sculpting. If you think of the statue of David, for example, this statue was created originally from a single giant block of marble that was then sculpted down to the sculpture that we know today. So in the end, what results is one giant single piece that makes up this piece of art. Now, what if instead of starting with one giant piece, we instead used a bunch of small pieces to put together something that is greater? These are Lego bricks that obviously are small, each in their own right, that were put together to create something large. In this example, they all kind of work together to accomplish a goal, so to speak, the goal of looking like the statue of David. Now, this example is not perfect because the original statue of David obviously is more beautiful than this replica made of Lego bricks. But hopefully the concept makes sense. Let's look at an example in actual web development. What I have here is copy and pasted from the Bootstrap website. If you're not familiar with Bootstrap, that's really not important right now, but it's enough to know that these 30 or 40 lines of code, copy and pasted from the Bootstrap website, represent a navigation bar that is pre-styled. Now, in the old days of web development, a single page on a website was usually a single HTML page. So if this is just the nav bar, a lot of times those web pages would end up being thousands and thousands of lines of HTML code, essentially making it one giant sculpture. Well, with modern frameworks like React, we can take code like this and we can put it into our own custom components. And we can put those components together to make something that is larger. But in our case, our code becomes a lot more maintainable and a lot more flexible. You can see I've given these kind of silly names to show you that these are not regular HTML elements. I can combine elements together that are real HTML elements, like you see here, into my own custom component called, for example, my awesome navbar or my awesome footer. We're not quite ready to dive into the syntax of React quite yet, but I'm going to give you a taste of it and a chance to play with it before we move on. So let's see this in practice. Over here you can see I have my React DOM.render and I'm rendering a custom component called navbar. And if I scroll up, you'll get a chance to see how I created that navbar. As a quick aside, one thing you might notice is that I'm using class name everywhere instead of class. That's not a mistake, that's just how you have to assign classes in React. We're going to cover that later. But for now, I'd like to give you a challenge that's going to require you to deduce what I've done here and try to replicate it for yourself. So let me put that here. Okay, your challenge is to see the navbar component that I have created and see if you can deduce how to create your own component called main content. It can return something really simple like a single H1 element, and afterwards I want you to render it below the navbar. You'll have to figure out how to render it below the navbar. Now, I've changed this a little bit for reasons that we'll talk about soon. But this line here, 51, this is where you're going to figure out how to render your own custom component main content. So first, build your custom component, looking at my example above to try and figure out how to do that. And secondly, render that component down here in React DOM.render. Pause the screencast and work on this challenge. Well, following the example above, we see that I created this component by creating a function. and the name of the function is the name of my component. So I will open up that function and return the content that I want to show up on my page. Above, I created a set of parentheses because I have many elements that I'm trying to return. I'll just do that just to keep things consistent for now. We'll create our H1 that says I'm learning React. And secondly, I can take my main content and I can render it by making it look kind of like an HTML element. In this case, it's a self-closing one, so I have main content as a single tag here. And if I hit save, we'll see that my H1 actually showed up on my page. And that's the concept of composability. It goes quite a bit deeper than this. We're going to see how we can make our components much more composable and reusable. But for now, let's move on to another reason why people really love React. And we'll cover that in the next lesson. Another major reason people love React is because it's something that we call declarative. So let's talk about declarative. To understand declarative, it's helpful to know that its opposite is something called imperative. When a program is declarative, we can simply tell it what should be done. More specifically, it's like the computer saying, just tell me what to do and I'll worry about all the nitty-gritty details on how to get it done. Its opposite, imperative, is when we need to tell the program how it should be done. Like the computer saying, I need you to describe to me every step along the way how to do something, and then I'll do it. Up until now, if you've mostly been just using vanilla JavaScript anytime you needed to create elements on the page, you've been doing it in an imperative way. In fact, let's go look at what that has been like. I've commented out my React DOM.render, and I'm going to put a challenge here for you. Okay, your challenge is to recreate this above line of code where we are rendering something to the screen using vanilla JavaScript by creating and appending an H1 to our div with the ID of root. We have our div ID of root. You'll need to select it and then append a new element. And I give you the step-by-step instructions right here. One little caveat is I don't want you using inner HTML because that kind of breaks the analogy down a little bit. Generally speaking, this is actually just a good way to practice the vanilla JavaScript that you have been learning so far, so it's always good to give it some practice. I'll give you a couple lines here, pause the screencast, and work on this challenge. Okay, let's work on this. So I'm going to create an H1, and I'll use document.createElement, and I'll make an H1. And then if I'm giving it some text content, I need to use the text content property of this DOM node and set it equal to, I don't know, maybe this is an imperative way to program. Then I need to give it a class name, so I'll use the class name property here and set it equal to, I think we said header. And finally, I need to append it to my div with the ID of root. So first I need to say document get element by ID root, and then use the append property or method to append my H1 to the DOM. So when I hit save, it should show up. This is an imperative way to program. Perfect. Now this example's a little bit on the nose because if you were really just putting something static that had nothing to do with user interaction, you probably would just go to your HTML page and stick it right inside the div here, right? But with React, we're building our entire page in JavaScript. And so doing something imperatively this way, where I have to tell it step by step how to create the element and then to add some text content and then add a class name and then append it to the DOM, that's going to get old pretty fast, especially even with something mildly more complicated than a single H1, like a very simple web page like this. As soon as we have more than one element, suddenly our 4 lines of code will become probably dozens or maybe even hundreds of lines of JavaScript code just to create and append all of these elements in the correct order and in the correct way. And so that brings us back to the idea of writing our code declaratively, and React allows us to do that in a really simple way. As we see back up top, when we comment this out and uncomment this, we essentially get to write our JavaScript as if it were HTML. We are relying on React to figure out how to turn what we have declaratively written as an H1 into the JavaScript code that's needed to append it to the DOM. In fact, if I were being strict and wanted to make this more equivalent, in order to add a class name, I can just add a class name as if this were an HTML element. Again, this is class name instead of class for a good reason, which we'll talk about. But that's a pretty minor difference to be able to do all of these lines of code in one single section right here. And that difference is going to compound as we get into more and more complicated UIs like we see here. So at this point, I could probably continue talking about different reasons that we're choosing to use React and that it will be really beneficial for you to learn React. As you see on my little list here, it's a very hireable skill and it's actively maintained by really skilled people at Facebook. However, at this point, I think we're overdue to just jump into the syntax, get your hands on the keyboard, and start learning and practicing React. So when you're ready, let's keep moving forward. Okay, let's finally address this elephant in the room, what we're looking at here, why we have what looks like HTML stuffed right inside our JavaScript. Well, fairly early on in the days of React, the React team created a syntax that's called JSX. JSX stands for JavaScript XML, but that's not terribly important for you to memorize. What's most important is to think of it as sort of a flavor of JavaScript that looks a lot like HTML. And with the introduction of JSX into React, it really made it so that React was very declarative instead of imperative. We can see up above what it took for us to create an H1, give it some text content, and give it a class name in regular vanilla JavaScript. But with JSX, the benefit is that we can just write what we're already used to writing with HTML. Now there's a couple of small differences. For example, instead of using class, I need to use class name. So I might say class name equals header, for example. And there's a few other of these, but for the most part, with JSX, we can just write the HTML that we're used to writing. At first, it might be a little bit confusing to write your HTML inside of your JavaScript, but I promise as you start doing React, it's really going to start making sense. You're going to learn to love JSX. Now, one thing that was really helpful for me to understand as I was learning was to see the difference between what JSX is and what our regular DOM elements are. So I'm going to do a few things. I'm going to uncomment these lines of code here, and I'm also going to take this piece of JSX and set it to a variable. We'll call it element. Then I can fix my React DOM.render by just putting element down here, and this will work exactly the same. But this allows us to console log it. So let's console log element, and I'll hit save so that this code will run. I'll open the console, and we'll see the differences here. First of all, on line 4, we are console logging the DOM element that we created with document.createElement. And that's what shows up in our console as what looks like an HTML element here. So that's this line right here. However, when we console log our element that we created with JSX, what actually got returned to us was this. And let me copy this out. And we can see that this is just a regular JavaScript object. Let me clean it up just a little bit to make it even more clear. So in the end, what we get from JSX, or rather what React is creating with JSX, is actually just plain old JavaScript objects. And those objects describe the DOM element that we want React to put onto the page for us. And if we look closely, we can see some interesting information here. First of all, we see that it has very similar properties, like we have class name, where we're setting that to header. And down here we have props, or short for properties, and we have class name. We also have something called children, and we can see that's actually the text that we put inside of our H1. That's about all I care to touch on with the object nature of React elements, but I thought it would be helpful to kind of kick us off understanding that JSX is kind of like a function that when it's run, returns us objects that React can interpret and use to create actual elements that get put on the screen for us. I'm going to comment this out so we can talk about one more thing, clean up this a little bit. And I'll go ahead and put this directly back in line to my React DOM.render, move these onto their own lines. The last thing that I wanted to touch on was that with JSX, we need to make sure that we are only returning a single parent element. In other words, I can't take this one H1 and place, say, a paragraph directly next to it. because in this case, we're rendering or attempting to render two sibling elements that sit side by side. In fact, if I try to run this, you can see React complains, and I guess in this case it says unknown error. Sometimes it will say that you have to wrap the elements that you're trying to render in some kind of parent element. Now, this doesn't mean that I can't put two elements on my page at any given time. It just means that I need to wrap them in something like a div, for example. So if I say a div that has an h1 and a paragraph inside, now I am rendering just one parent element, and it doesn't really matter how many children elements are included, as long as I have one parent element that I'm rendering. So I can hit save. We'll see that this is working just fine. Now, remember how I was able to save my h1 as a variable? Well, I can actually save a whole collection of JSX, for example, this div with the h1 and the paragraph, as a variable. So let's say const page equals, and then I can paste in my elements here. Now, to me, this looks a little bit crazy. So normally what I like to do is move my elements, my JSX, onto their own lines as if this were HTML. But in that case, I need to go ahead and wrap everything in parentheses. Now, take a second and think, how is it that I can then fix what I have down here? We can see we have a syntax error. How can I fix this so that when I refresh the page, this is still working? Pause here and see if you can figure out how to make this work again. Well, all of my JSX is being saved under the variable of page, so I should just be able to put page here and hit refresh, and sure enough, that's working just fine. Hopefully some of you were kind of curious to see what this looks like as a JavaScript object. If we console log page, we can see that essentially we got what we had last time, but this time it's a little more involved. Specifically, in the children property of our div, we see that there's other React elements in there. I'm not going to dive too deep into that. Feel free to copy and paste what you see in the console, maybe clean it up a little bit and analyze it. But the point is, I can save a whole bunch of JSX into a single variable and then use that variable kind of like any other variable. And the key is, that's because what I'm getting back when I write my JSX is just a JavaScript object. Okay, I'm going to clean this page up a little bit. And I'm going to comment out our page because I'm going to give you a challenge. Okay, I left our example of const page up here just for reference, but I did delete our code that we had at the bottom, which actually enabled us to put something on the screen. And that's because I want you to practice it again. So your challenge is to create a navigation bar using JSX. I've given you some instructions here on what the content should actually be. And as I mentioned at the very end, don't worry about styling yet. We're going to cover styling soon, but for now, what you're going to have is just going to look like plain HTML that's unstyled. So pause the screencast here and see if you can complete this challenge. Okay, before I worry about the React DOM.render bit, I'm going to create a new variable. We'll call it actually, let's call it navbar. And I'm going to use my parentheses so that I can start my element on the next line. And like I mentioned, we want to use the semantic nav element. And inside of there, I'm going to have an h1. Let's call it Bob's Bistro. Maybe this is a restaurant. Okay. And then we have an unordered list. And hopefully while you were playing with this, you came to realize that it doesn't matter how nested I get. Just like in HTML, I can nest this as deep as I want. We'll create 3 list items. And it said pricing, about, and contact. And I don't know, maybe if this is a restaurant, I'll say menu instead of pricing. Okay, I've got my JSX for my navbar set up. And then the last bit, which was just meant to be something repetitive that allows you to get some muscle memory for this, is to use React DOM.render. And the first parameter is what do I want to render, and that's my navbar JSX. And the second thing is where do I want to render it. I'm going to do that by selecting with getElementById my div with the ID of root that is over in my index.html right there. Okay, I should hit save, and sure enough, it's pretty ugly. Obviously, we want to style this. We're going to get to that soon. I hope that challenge went well for you. If you struggled, please don't keep pushing forward. Go back, rewatch this lesson, see if you can do this again from scratch, or maybe just try typing it 10 or 15 times if you need to. Also, if you get totally stuck, don't forget that this is a community. You can reach out on Discord, ask your question, and you are more than likely to get a really friendly, helpful response back. When you're feeling pretty good about this, let's keep moving forward. Okay, at this point, it's probably time for us to switch away from the easy way of getting React set up in our project to the more correct way. Now, inside of Scrimba, that means something different than it means inside of your own local environment. Scrimba has kind of some magic that's happening under the hood that's helping React just kind of work in our project. So I'm going to show you a couple steps for how I do this in Scrimba. You won't really have to worry too much about that because even when you're creating your own new scrim in Scrimba, it'll just ask you what type of scrim you want, and you'll just tell it that it's a React scrim and it'll set everything up for you. So what I need to do is in my index.html, I'm actually going to remove all of my unpackage.com CDNs here. So I can get rid of these 3 lines. And I don't need this type text Babel anymore because I'm not pulling in Babel. And instead, over here on the left, I'm going to add the dependencies that I need. And I need React, and I need React-DOM. If you're a little bit more familiar with developing in JavaScript, you might recognize that these dependencies are similar to having a package.json where you install these packages through npm. If pretty much everything I just said doesn't make sense, don't worry about it at all. I am going to talk about different options for local setup later. If you absolutely need to follow along in your local environment instead of here on Scrimba.com, you can continue to use the CDN way that we were just using like this. But otherwise, I just recommend doing things here inside of Scrimba. Our main focus is not going to be how to set up React, but rather how to write React. So I will take those back out. And now that I have taken those CDNs out, it means that I no longer have global variables added to my window like React DOM. So if I try to save this, we're going to see I have an unexpected token angle bracket. And that's because, well, it doesn't know what React is at all. What I need to do now is actually import React from React. This might not seem like it's doing anything because I'm actually not referencing React anywhere here. I've got React DOM, but that's something different. However, React is where the JSX syntax is defined, and so I need to import React in order for this to work at all. Now, the astute among you might be familiar with the fact that with React version 17, I technically don't need to import React. However, currently at the time of this recording, Scrimba is not yet set up to support the fact that React version 17 and above no longer requires you to import React in order for JSX to work. So anyway, throughout the duration of this course, I will be using import React from React, and that's because, well, I need to in this environment currently. Let's hit save again and see what we run into next. And this says cannot use import statement outside of a module. And oh, you know what? I think that has to do with another sort of magic piece that is happening under the hood with Scrimba. So I'm going to add this .pack. That's not something you'll need to do in the real world. So this should be, yep, React DOM is not defined. That's the error I expected to see. And that's because whenever we're using React DOM, I will also need to import React DOM from React-DOM. And now, fingers crossed, I should get something that works again. Okay, there we go. We're back on the screen, and everything is set up a little more similar to how you normally would see a React project set up. Don't be overly concerned with all of these implementation details. However, this is how I'm going to be setting up my projects from here on. And at this point, we actually have enough knowledge for us to start working on this section's project, which is a static HTML page in React. However, before we jump into that, I want to exercise your brain with a little thought experiment, and we are going to do that in the next screencast. I'd like to do a quick thought experiment with you, and that is to figure out why we're using React DOM.render instead of just using the DOM append method that you've probably used before in JavaScript. I've written the first line for you, and that's to import React from React. That will just allow you to write some JSX. Your challenge, as you can see in this little 4-step process here, is to create just a really simple sample page in JSX. It has to be greater than or equal to 4 elements, just to get your fingers working a little bit. And I want you to save that JSX to a variable. Remember that that variable needs to be one parent element with some children elements nested inside of it. In other words, we can't just have 2 sibling elements saved in a variable in JSX. Then I want you to select the div with the ID of root using whatever selector you want to use, and then use .append to append your JSX. If you need to do a quick Google search for how to use .append, that's totally fine. And then before you run your code, I want you to see if you can guess what's going to show up in the browser before you run the code, and then run your code and see if you can explain what does show up in the browser. Pause here and play around with this a bit. Okay, well, let's create our JSX. We'll say const page equals, and I'll open my parentheses so I can write my JSX on its own line. And we'll start with a div just to surround everything. And I don't know, let's say I'm making a page about why I love React. We'll say this is my awesome website in React. And then maybe an H3 that says, here are the reasons I love React. And we'll use an ordered list. It's not terribly important what you actually put in here. I'll just use some of the reasons that I've been talking about. It's composable. It's declarative. It's a very hireable skill to have. Let's see, I need to get rid of this. And it's very actively maintained by some very skilled people. Again, the JSX you chose to put in here is not terribly important. So we'll use document.getElementById root and then use the DOM nodes append method to append our page, and we'll see what shows up here. Now, of course, I know what's going to show up, so I'm just going to run the code, and we see that we get object object. This object object is sort of a string representation of a regular JavaScript object. Something I can do to actually make that object appear is to stringify it using JSON. So I can actually say json.stringify, and we will stringify that object so that it puts JSON on the page. I'll hit save, and look at that. We get a JavaScript object. Now, step 4, see if you can explain why this actually shows up in the browser. Well, kind of the whole purpose of this thought experiment was to remind you that JSX returns plain JavaScript objects. At this point in time, it has nothing to do with the DOM. It's not recognized by the browser as anything important dealing with the DOM. It's only when we try to render it using React DOM.render that React can take these JavaScript objects and actually turn them into real DOM elements that the browser can interpret as things like first level headers or ordered lists. So let's go ahead for the sake of practice and fix this. I'm going to update our challenge here. Okay, simply put, your challenge is to fix our code. And don't forget, we're not using those CDNs in our HTML anymore, which is what used to give us a global variable called React DOM. So you'll have to see if you can remember how we get access to React DOM. Pause the screencast here and try to fix our code. In order to use React DOM, I will need to import it, and we'll import it from the React DOM package. Then instead of selecting my div with the ID of root, actually I'm going to need that anyway, so I will leave that code there. I'll say React DOM.render. The thing I want to render is my page, so we'll put page, and the where I want to render it is inside of that div with the ID of root. I'm going to comment this out so it doesn't break it. We'll hit save, and there we go. Awesome. So simply put, React DOM's job, or the React DOM.render method's job, is to take React elements and interpret them in a way that turns them into real DOM elements that the browser can understand. Okay, with that understanding, it's only a small jump to work on our section project, which is to build a static page in React. We're going to start the first steps of that in the next screencast. Okay, we're finally at our first challenge. I'm really excited to start working on this. I've included a Google slide of what you're aiming for with this challenge. Notice there's really no styling being applied here at all. It's just bare HTML. So if we go look at the challenge, essentially you are starting completely from scratch, and your job is to build the HTML for our section project as you see it here. We'll be adding just a little bit of styling to it later after we learn how to do that. And I've included a couple hints here. For simplicity, I've imported the React logo file directly into our file explorer here, which means that you can reference it in your image element that you create with source equals and then using a /react-logo.png. I also have a hint here about how to set the width attribute. Just remember that JSX is almost identical to HTML. And in fact, for what you're working on here, you really shouldn't see any difference between the JSX that you'll write and what you would normally write in HTML. Don't forget that we are no longer using our CDNs, so you'll have to remember how to bring in React, React DOM, and so forth. That's all the hints I'm going to give you, so pause the screencast here and work on this challenge. Well, first things first, let's import React from React and import React DOM from React-DOM. We can't really do anything until we've done that. Then I'm going to save a variable called page. And as a heads up, this isn't actually going to be a very common way for us to deal with JSX. We're going to see very soon how we can do this in a more conventional way. For the sake of learning, though, I think this is a good way for us to start. Just to do a bit of a sanity check, I'm going to just throw an H1 in here. It says testing, and then do my last step, which is React DOM.render. And we want to render our page. And we want to put it at the div with the ID of root. Let's see if that's working. Okay, cool. We have testing showing up. That means that everything else is set up correctly. Okay, so let's start building our page here. I'm going to surround everything in a div just because I can only have one element here, rather one parent element here instead of any sibling elements. And the first thing I'll put in is an image. And just like in HTML, I can provide an image source. And like I mentioned up in the hints, I'm going to have react-logo.png. The / just means look in the same folder for a file called react-logo.png. Now, if I refresh this, I'm going to get a pretty large image here. So just like in HTML, I can set the width to be something specific like 40 pixels. And that looks a little more manageable, a little less crazy, not taking up my whole screen. Next, I've got something that looks kind of like an H1 that says fun facts about React. So we will add that in there. And awesome. Now, because my H1 is a block element, it has floated below my image, even though my image is technically an inline element. And that's kind of to be expected, or rather that's what we're aiming for. And then it looks like the last thing is an unordered list with these 5 list items. So I'll go ahead and add that unordered list. We'll do some list items. I'm going to hold Shift Option down to copy these lines, and then just start typing in some of these facts. Okay, and yeah, these are some pretty interesting facts about React. I'll hit save. And awesome. It looks like we essentially got to where we wanted to get to with our goal here. I'll go ahead and clean up some of my comments up here from the challenge. And great work. Hopefully you were able to follow along with that. Now, like I mentioned, saving all of our JSX to a single variable like this actually isn't really that common, nor is it convenient at all. So what we're going to start covering is a much more common way, and that is by creating custom components. Before we jump into that, I want to give you a quick quiz over the topics that we've talked about so far, and we will do that in the next screencast. Before jumping right into the next topic, I thought it would be smart to have a quick little pop quiz on some of the topics that we've covered up to this point. Because this is Scrimba, you can just click into this quiz.md file and answer the questions here. So pause the screencast and work on this quiz. Why do we need to import React from React in our files? Well, it's because the JSX syntax is defined in React. And if we were to remove React, we would see that it's telling us React is not defined. Even though we're not using React in our code, the JSX here sort of demands that React be a part of our code base. So I will go type that over here. React is what defines JSX. So in order to use JSX, we need to import React. If I were to console log the page in our index.js file, what would show up? Hopefully you actually attempted to answer this question before just going ahead and console logging it. Before I hit save, I know that page is a bunch of JSX, which in reality just returns some JavaScript objects. So when I console log page, I should just see a JavaScript object here. And sure enough, there it is. If you look closely at that object, you'll see a children property, and that children property has more React elements nested inside. Well, that's because we have our React element here with children that are more React elements. So over here, we can say a JavaScript object. These are React elements that describe what React should eventually add to the real DOM for us. Okay, number 3, what is wrong with this code? Hopefully you noticed that our JSX here is 2 sibling elements, and remembered that we actually need all of our JSX to be nested under a single parent element. As a quick sneak peek, in the future you may learn that you can use something that looks like an empty tag like this in order to wrap your JSX in something that doesn't actually create another parent element. These are called fragments, but that's more a little piece of trivia. We're not going to concern ourselves too much with that in this course. Next is number 4. What does it mean for something to be declarative instead of imperative? The way we described it before was to say that declarative programming meant I could tell the program what to accomplish and it would know how to accomplish the specific step-by-step details, whereas imperative meant I still needed to tell the computer step-by-step how to do everything. An example I like to think of this is to imagine myself asking a friend to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for me. If I were doing that declaratively, I could simply say, could you make me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich? And I would assume that they knew how to take care of the individual steps to do so. If I were being imperative, on the other hand, I would have to tell them to grab a slice of bread with their fingers and place that slice of bread gently on a plate, then to grab a knife from the drawer and to put the knife into a jar of peanut butter, and so forth. There certainly are times when something imperative is warranted. However, generally speaking, writing code declaratively is a much better developer experience and honestly usually leads to fewer bugs in the end. So declarative means I can tell the computer what to do and expect it to handle the details. Imperative means I need to tell it how to do each step. And lastly, what does it mean for something to be composable? Well, that just means that I can create small pieces that I put together to make a greater whole. In terms of web development, it means I can take pieces of my UI, my user interface, and put them into their own components, and then piece those components together to build my page. So what does it mean for something to be composable? It means that we have small pieces that we can put together to make something larger, and I'll even say greater than the individual pieces. This is a pretty broad definition of composable because the idea and concept of composability extends throughout all of computer programming, not just web development, and especially not just React. But I think we've gotten the point across. I'm really excited to keep moving forward. We are now going to jump into sort of the baseline level of React and start learning how to create our own components, and it's just going to get more and more exciting from there. So strap yourselves in and let's keep moving forward. When we talked about composability being one of the major benefits of React, we talked about the possibility in React to create our own custom components. What we currently have going on is we're saving our JSX elements here, our React elements, in a variable, and then rendering that variable directly with React DOM.render. And although this has been working for us so far, it doesn't allow us a lot of flexibility when it comes to creating our own components in React. And even further, it's also pretty obvious we wouldn't want to take all of our markup and stuff it directly into React DOM.render, even though I think technically this might work just fine. Actually, I'm curious. Let's give this a shot. I'll comment this out. Okay, so everything is technically still working, but we run into the same issue as we used to in kind of the old days of creating HTML code, where if we're trying to stuff everything into one place, not only do the elements not become reusable, but it becomes really difficult to maintain as a developer. So creating our variable up here got us one step closer, but it's still not quite good enough. Instead, what we are going to start learning about is creating our own custom components. Now, I gave you a taste of this early on in the course, but we're going to actually learn it the real way now. In programming, the concept of a function is one that allows us to write some code that we can then execute over and over and over again just by calling that function. And React adopts this same concept of having a function that allows us to create user interface or create elements over and over and over again if we wanted to. Knowing how functions work, it's really tempting to say, okay, well, I'm going to create a function and let's give it a temporary name for just a second. And we might say, well, I have a function and I want it to return my UI, my elements here, anytime that function gets called. So I might try something like this. Let me get rid of page here, and then instead of page, we might say, well, let's call our temporary name function, and that is going to return the React elements that we asked it to, and therefore we have a function that we can reuse. Well, let's see what happens. Look at that. It actually worked. And what we have here is basically 90% of the way into creating our own custom components. A function like this that returns React elements is considered in React a component. However, there's a couple of conventions that we need to follow for everything to work correctly all the time. The first one is we need to use Pascal case instead of camel case for our component names. All that means is